Hello, I'm Kerr. Welcome to my art studio. Watercolour brushes come in many shapes and sizes, but I think these goat hair brushes are probably among the most versatile. In this video, I'll show you exactly how to use them, and if you watch towards the end of the video, I'll introduce you to a couple of books that I know you will find really useful if you're thinking of using one of these. So, are you ready? So this is the brush that we're going to look at today. Now I know a lot of people call it a HAKE because it's spelt H-A-K-E, but I know that's not the correct pronunciation. Now I think the correct pronunciation is HAKE, but I'm sure there'll be somebody out there to correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm quite happy to be corrected. So you call it whatever you like, so that I don't get into any big discussions about the way the name is pronounced. I always call it my big wash brush. Now these are all made the same way. They're made with goat hair. Some of them are stitched and some of them have a metal ferrule. It's just personal choice. It makes no difference to the actual working of the brush as to how the brush is made, because as I said, they're all made of goat hair. And in fact, they're not very expensive. So let me show you how to go about using one of these first time round. Now here I've got a bowl of water. Now I'm going to put a bit of colouring in the water because otherwise you won't be able to actually see what I'm doing. So let's put a bit of colouring. Now when people first use one of these brushes, they're quite horrified because they end up flooding their work. And this is why. If I put my brush in there and I load it up with water, give it a good old soaking, and I'll put my little pan next to it. Now you watch how much water comes out. Can you see that? Now that is an enormous amount of water. You would not want that amount of water on your painting. So that is the big mistake that a lot of people make when they first use one of these. They don't know how much water it contains. Well, they wouldn't because nobody's told them. So this is what you do. When you load up your brush with water, you wipe it like that on both sides of your container. Now a little point about the container. This has got a rounded edge. Now if you wipe your brush on a rounded edge, it's not going to take off as much water as if you wiped it on a sharp edge. So here I've got a container that's got quite a sharp edge. You can feel it with your finger. If I wipe my brush on there, I'm going to get a lot more water off than if I wiped it on a rounded edge. So let's put this one to one side. Now I've got some colours on here. Now I'm just using up some of the colours from my store of colours that I don't use very often. So these are not my everyday paints. If I'm just doing practicing or something, I use up the colours that I don't normally have in my paint box because I don't like wasting things. Okay, so I've put my brush in the water and I've wiped it on the edge like that. So it's not dripping anymore. So now I can go into my paint and pull some paint out. Now I need to load both sides of the brush, and you might think, well, why? Well, the reason is if you load both sides of the brush, you get that beautiful chiseled edge. I hope you can see that on the camera. It's a very, very sharp chiseled edge with all the little hairs all joined together. Now, most of the painting with the big wash brush is going to be done with this lovely sharp edge. So I load both sides of my brush. Now that looks like a lot of water still, doesn't it? Well, you're quite right, it is. So, how can I take the water out of that brush without losing all the paint that I've just put in it? Well, this is what you do. You get a piece of kitchen roll, move that over. You get a piece of kitchen roll, which is rounded, and you put your brush on the roll like that, so that the only bit of the brush that's touching the roll is this bit here up near the ferrule. Not the points, because that's where your paint is. So you put your brush on there like that, and if you want to take off even more water, you turn it over and press it down on the roll. Can you see how the points of my brush are nowhere near that roll, so I haven't lost most of my paint? So that's how you can take water out of your brush without losing your paint. Clever, eh? So now when we go back to the palette, we've got a lot less water on there now. Now when you get used to using one of these brushes, you won't have to do the kitchen roll bit, because you will instinctively know when you wipe the water off your brush on the edge of your container, you will know whether or not you've got enough or too much water in your brush, and you will take the excess water out on a tissue before you load up. But just for now, because you're not used to using it, we'll load up and then we'll take the excess water out on the kitchen roll. Now, sometimes when you're painting, you will find that your brush has bent like that. And it's quite difficult to use the edge of it because your brush has bent. These hairs won't spring back like artificial hairs will. They will bend and they'll stay there. So what you do is you just turn your brush over and you use the edge like that. And it'll gradually flatten itself out. And then when it bends again, when you're painting, you just turn your brush over and it will gradually flatten itself out. Now, if you want to get some real textures with your brush, then you do that to it. Now, I can hear people going, "Oh, shock, horror, she's bending the bristles on her brush." Animal hair is incredibly strong and tough. If it wasn't, all the animals in the world would be bald by now, after they've been preening their fur and scratching and rolling in the mud and everything else that they do. If their hairs broke off and twisted very easily, they'd all be bald. So this brush I've had for years, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. So if you want to do some really, some lovely textures and some really interesting looking marks, which we'll do in a minute, then you just separate the hairs, dip it into your paint, and off you go. And you think, well, how am I going to get that back to normal? Well, let's have a look. If I just put the ends of my brush, not the whole thing, just the ends, into my water, and I wipe it on the side, look, and all I did was put the very tip of the brush into my water. You don't have to immerse the whole thing. If you do, then you have to start all over again by cleaning, but you just put the very tips of the brush and all the little hairs will immediately all come back together. They're ever so well behaved. Now let's have a look at using some of these paints and making some marks on some watercolour paper. Now I've already mixed up some paint, and if you notice, when I tip my tray like this, nothing runs anywhere because the concentration of the paint is actually quite thick, so no weak and watery washes. So I dip my brush into the water and wipe it on the edge. You've watched me do that already. And I'm going to load up my paint on both sides of the brush. Remember, we need that chiselled edge, and the only way to get that chiselled edge is to load it on both sides of the brush. And take your time, add a little more paint if you need, don't rush. Now I know, probably only by experience, that there's too much water there, because if I, can you see, it's running. Now I don't want it to run, so kitchen roll trick. Now I come to my paper, I've got that lovely sharp chiselled edge, and I know I've got the right amount of water in my brush, so I can make my marks. Now when you get the paint breaking like that, let it. Don't go back and try and fill all the gaps in, because with watercolour, the least number of strokes you do, the better. The least number of strokes will make your painting look fresh, because the more times you go back over something, you're pushing the paint down into the paper and it becomes rather dull looking. You want your paint to float on the surface. See how I'm twisting my brush? I've gone from a wide stroke right down to a very narrow stroke with just that great big brush. Now if I'm running out of paint, I can turn my brush over and use the other side. Now I can get some little narrow lines if I want to. Look at that. Use it on its edge to get an even narrower line. Now, would you have thought that you could get lines that small with this great big brush? Load up both sides. It's a bit like a letter X. Can you see? I'm stroking like that, like a letter X. There's that lovely chiselled edge again. See the amount of space you can cover with just one stroke. I see so many people going over and over and over and over, and going back over again and then going back over again. Each time you do that, you're pushing your paint down into the paper. Keep it lovely and fresh. So you have to really plan where your paint is going to go before you put your brush on the paper. Don't just go for it and dab all over the place. Plan where your strokes are going to go. Now if I load up my brush with some different colours, there's my lovely chiselled edge. Now I'm going to use only the corner, just the corner. Make little marks like that. Now all I'm doing is stroking. I'm not dabbing, I'm pulling the brush towards me, stroking it. And I'm just using that one little corner. See? Now without washing the brush or without cleaning the brush, I'm going to go into a darker colour. Because I started with a light colour, I can now go straight into my dark colour without having to worry about washing my brush. Stroke the brush. If you think you've got a bit too much water, kitchen roll trick. And again, using the corner, I could go back over what I've done. I'm just stroking it towards me. Then if I go into an even darker colour, load both sides of the brush, get that lovely chiselled edge, can you see? And then go in again, stroke towards you. And we have a bush. Now when that's dried off, you take your rigger brush and you put in some little branches, and there you've got a bush. How easy is that? Now if you take some of the water out of your brush, so we're going to use a slightly drier paint. Load up again. Both sides of the brush. Lovely chiselled edge. Now, is there an easier way to paint grasses? Load up again. Change the colour a bit this time. Always take your time loading your brush. That's the secret. Beautiful chiselled edge. Now you could use your brush this way. And with the corner of the brush you could put some darker bits underneath, and there you've got some vegetation growing. Now you could split the hairs up, and I can hear people going, "Oh, shock horror!" It doesn't hurt your brush. These are animal hairs. They're pretty tough. As I said, all the animals in the world would be bald by now if the hairs broke off every time they got bent. See that? You can get some really interesting marks. How about that for putting leaves on the end of a branch? Wonderful. Now let me show you something else we can do. Let's load up our brush on both sides and get that lovely chiselled edge. And then I'm going to put one side of the brush through a different colour. Can you see I've got that colour on one side of the brush and that colour on another side of the brush. Now watch. How about that for a path or a beach or something along those lines? Can you see the two colours that I've used? Because I double loaded my brush. I put the initial colour on first, which was the brown, and then I picked up a little bit of the reddy colour, and look, how attractive is that? Now let's just play around with a few of the colours that we've got on the palette here. As I say, I hate wasting paint. Let's see what we can do. Let's take a piece of plastic card and see what we get. Well, there we go, a pile of rocks. Let's go back to our paint. Double load the brush, both sides. And let's just put in some marks down here and see what happens. Stroke the brush along the paper. Oh look, we've got a bush. Let's have a few grasses. And let's have a few more over here. Pick up the rigger, roll the rigger, and pop in a few little branches in here. And maybe we'll have some grass growing up here. Maybe a little bit down here as well. You see how you can make things up as you go along. You don't have to draw everything out and have everything perfect before you start. You can just make it up as you go along. Look, let's put a bit of texture here with the rigger. Oh, we've got a lovely little landscape, look. Remember to leave little bits of white paper here and there. It just gives your paintings a bit of sparkle. If you fill in every single little bit with paint, it begins to look a little bit dull. So just leave a little bit of sparkle here and there. Now I'm going to sit and play with this for ages, so I think I better stop. So why don't you have a go? Why don't you get yourself one of these big wash brushes? They're not very expensive. They're one of the cheapest brushes you can buy, actually. So don't be afraid to use it. Now these brushes have been used for many, many years, but one of the best known modern day artists who used this brush was a gentleman called Ron Ranson. Now Ron sadly is no longer with us. He died quite recently, but he has written a whole series of books on using this big wash brush. Now, these books were written, I believe, in the 1980s. so they are they are quite old, and some of the illustrations in them are quite old-fashioned, and the printing is quite old-fashioned. But the information and the techniques in here are absolutely wonderful, and they will never go out of date. Yes, the printing is a little dated, but the information in here is an absolute little gold mine. When you can see what you can actually achieve with a great big brush like that, I think you'll be amazed. I just love this one. Look at the mist at the back here, and that's just done by dropping paint into some wet paper and just letting it bleed. And look, this is what we did earlier. We made marks like this. We flicked in a few grasses with our rigger brush. If you're interested in these books, they're still available, they're still being printed, and I'll put a link to them in the description below this video. But these are the ones I think are the most useful for people starting out. Big brush watercolour and distilling the scene. It takes a while to get used to one of these brushes, but when you do, I know you will absolutely love them. If you haven't done so already, then consider clicking that subscribe button and the little bell icon, because that will let you know when I upload another video. If you've enjoyed this one, then give it a thumbs up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Now remember, there is an artist in everyone. Goodbye for now.